Up until this point, we've talked a lot about why feedback breaks in terms of defensiveness, and we've also spent a good chunk of time talking about what effective feedback actually sounds like, both redirectional feedback and reinforcement feedback. But there's also a part that a lot of us miss. We can deliver feedback really, really well, and there can still be no change in the after. And that doesn't mean that you said it wrong, or you didn't deliver it well, or you didn't modify your approach to account for the defensiveness. Like, it doesn't mean you didn't do all of those things. It means that there's a separate part that also has to be focused on. So yes, you do have to get the conversation right, but a lot of times that's not actually the place where the feedback is breaking. And the surprising part about feedback is that feedback itself isn't the hardest part. It may seem like the hardest part in the beginning when you're learning how to give effective feedback that's anchored to behavior and specifics and not leaving any room for ambiguity, all of those things that we've talked about before. But that's not actually the hard part. The hardest part is what happens after, because feedback is meant to change behavior, right? Or reinforce behavior that's working really well. So if nothing's changing, then it's probably not the feedback that you're delivering that's the problem. It's a reinforcement problem. It's the what happens in the after. And yes, we've got to make sure the conversation happens well, it lands right, but that's not going to be the only factor that determines whether or not things are going to change. Because once the conversation ends, something else takes over, and if that part isn't working, you will see no change. And the thing is, one singular feedback conversation is not going to change behavior in the long term. That's just not how it works, guys. And you know that. Like, you know that, but also when you're a leader, like, you kind of don't want to know that because you're like, I gave the feedback. It should work. I should be done. I'm sorry. If there's nothing in place to reinforce the feedback that you've given, it's just not going to stay active enough to actually matter. Like, it's just not how it works. And the pattern is you give clear feedback, right? We've done it well, we've practiced, we've done all of our things right. The person nods, they might even agree, and then nothing changes. And this is where a lot of us get stuck because we feel like the conversation worked, but then it doesn't carry over into execution. And look at it logically. If the work isn't changing, that means the behavior that is driving the work isn't changing. And when this occurs, the instinct that we have is pretty predictable. We want to say it again. We want to go back and repeat ourselves. And so we repeat ourselves. We go give the feedback again. Nothing changes. So then we're like, all right, I'm going to repeat this clearly and directly and like maybe slightly more intensely, aggressively even. And then, yeah, nothing changes. And so we just keep saying things over and over and over again, and we get stuck in this loop. And now your attention starts to shift and you stop looking at what's happening in the work and you start questioning the person. Not because that's really your intention, but because repeating yourself isn't working. And what happens when we repeat ourselves a lot? We tend to get frustrated because the outcome isn't changing. And that's the trap. The issue is not how many times you're saying something. The issue is, have you set up the right environment after you've given the feedback to actually allow for meaningful change to occur? And this is the point where your assumption might start to shift about the other person, which is very dangerous, so do not fall into this trap, because it stops being about the work and it starts becoming about the person who is not changing their behavior for the work, because you've said it, you've clarified it, nothing's changed. And so the interpretation to you becomes, well, they must not be listening. Well, they must not care because they're not doing anything differently. And I already said that and I don't want to have to say it again, right? And you get stuck in this whole frustration loop. And when you get frustrated, you know, like your team can feel that, the individual that you're directing it towards can feel that, everyone they work with can feel that. Like, you're not being slick. Everyone knows that you're getting frustrated. And that really doesn't help anything because now you're creating like a people problem, a relationship problem. And really, it's the after that you need to be focused on. Instead of trying to push through, like we talked about with defensiveness, if you look over to the right, that smaller flow chart is what happens a lot of times when we're having a conversation and it's not landing. There's a misread that's going on somewhere. And so the instinct as a person, as a normal human, is to be like, well, I just need to kind of push through this to get to the other side. And so you add more pressure, more pressure, more pressure. And you think that more pressure is going to change the outcome, but actually all it does is it leads to less change. So this is the moment to pause, because what feels like the problem usually isn't what's actually driving the result that you're seeing. The real lever for you to pull as a leader is reinforcement, because feedback alone doesn't drive behavior. Feedback plus reinforcement does. And feedback can absolutely point to what needs to change and how it needs to change. Like, in fact, that's exactly the role of feedback. You've got to be clear. You've got to clarify. And you can create that clarity and you can make those alignments in the moment, but none of that is going to hold once the conversation ends if you haven't done anything to bring that feedback back into the work and make it visible. Because if you don't do that, people are going to default to what they already know. And that's the rub. Behavior doesn't change because of one conversation. It changes when you keep it active long enough for it to stick. And that takes time. That's never a one and done. And once you understand that, like really understand that and internalize that, what to do next becomes so much clearer. And I will tell you, like, I'm not saying this lightly. I have literally sat at many companies in many executive meetings with many different leaders, and I have seen this be the breakdown time and time again, because the conversation that's happening at the executive level is, we have already told them this. Why isn't anything changing? And then it's like me raising my hand and going, hi, have we done anything to reinforce the behavior change? Have we asked our leaders to reinforce this in their daily stand-ups? Have we asked our people to keep this top of mind for their group of employees that they are leading and supporting? Well, that's not their job. We've already told them once. They should change the behavior. I mean, sure, listen, you can do it that way. Nothing's going to change. It's not going to work, and you're going to end up and just like, you're going to be like Sisyphus, just pushing the ball up the hill eternally. You have to understand, and I'm not trying to lecture you, like I'm just saying this because I'm very passionate about it. If you truly want behavior to change long term, you have to put in guardrails to reinforce the behavior change. Period. Full stop. End of story. Why we don't do this? We could talk about that another time. Probably because it's more difficult. Probably because it puts the onus on us as the leader. And we would love as leaders to say, well, I've given the feedback, now it's on them. I've done my part. I'm done. I gave the feedback, I did it correctly, I followed all of the rules, and now I have zero to do with it. Wrong. You have everything to do with it. And it's your job to make sure that it happens. And that's hard. And I get that. And I know that being a leader is a full-time job in addition to your business as usual tasks and functions, because you're a working leader, as we all are. So I get it. I get that it's harder. But if you put this in on the front end, it is going to pay off in dividends on the back end. And this is where so many people drop the ball. Why does it break? We've got 3 different areas that really contribute to not having any reinforcement in the after. If there is no follow-up, if it gets mentioned once and then dropped, people are not going to pay attention to it. If there's no visibility, like, okay, well, I made the change, I did what they asked me to do, but like no one seems to notice. So like, is it really something that I should focus on, or should I just bring my focus back to the other things that are getting checked on? Or there's no signal that it matters. Like nothing is indicating to me that this is a priority. Like, sure, I had the conversation with them once, but like they never brought it back up. So like, I don't think it matters that much, because if it did, I feel like they would be checking on it. Like that's the view from the team member. So if you have nothing planned to bring your feedback back into the workflow, it's going to fade. And that's not because people don't care. It's not because they're ignoring you. It's because they have other priorities and other things in their daily work life that are continuing to move. So if you give feedback on a report and someone adjusts it once and then you never bring it back up again, you don't review it with them, you don't follow up with them, you don't reference it in your next one-on-one, what do you think is going to happen? It's going to get treated like a one-time comment from you, not a consistent long-term standard. If there's no signal that what you said matters long-term, it's not going to stick. And without that, people are going to fall back into what they already know. Because as human beings, we like to live in an area that is comfortable. We like to do things that we're comfortable with, that we're already good at. When someone's pushing us to change our behavior, they've got to help us along the way, because there is that messy middle that I'm sure you guys have heard referred to before. You have to live in the messy middle for a while before you get through to the other side. And if there is no one reinforcing and helping you and supporting you through that messy middle, you're going to start leaning back into your default pattern, which is what you're comfortable with. And that's normal. That's human. If there's no reinforcement, people aren't going to necessarily push themselves through. They're just going to go back to what is faster, what's familiar, what they feel gets the work done most efficiently. And they're not just going to magically start changing their behavior because of one conversation. And if you're honest with yourself, if your leader had a conversation with you and gave you feedback and then never mentioned it again, are you going to think it's important? Are you going to change the behavior? Or are you going to do just enough to get them off your back in that moment and then go back to doing things the way you've always done them? I don't know. You tell me. Drop it in the comments. Do we recognize this? Is this sounding familiar? If it happens to you, it happens to your people. So there's that. So the reframe for us. Reinforcement so often gets misunderstood, and reinforcement is not micromanaging. No one wants a micromanager. I don't want you to micromanage. I don't want anyone micromanaging me. Micromanagement, not a good trait for a leader, period. Please don't do that. Reinforcement is not micromanagement. Reinforcement is not hovering over someone, following up consistently, making them give you an end of day report. That's not reinforcement. That's annoying. Reinforcement is not about controlling every single step. It's about making sure the feedback that you gave that was important doesn't disappear after you gave it. It makes sure that you're keeping it visible for them, because if it doesn't hold and you're not showing that it's a priority, it's not going to stick. So instead of focusing only on how you deliver feedback, you have to think about, well, how do I help make this show up in the after? And what happens after feedback is really what makes it stick. And this is where behavior is either going to shift towards what you want it to, or it's going to reset back to what's familiar to them. And if you want something to stick, you have to look at how it shows up in the work after. So let's talk about how practically we actually do that. We're going to have 5 kind of to-dos on our checklist when we talk about managing the after, right? This is after the feedback is delivered. The first thing, you want to name what better looks like when you see it. Most leaders try to wait until something is fully fixed or fully perfect to respond. But behavior doesn't shift all at once. It changes in pieces and parts. You start to see patterns, you start to see small improvements before the end result is there. So if someone turns in a report that's still not where it needs to be, but the structure is a bit clearer, the key points have been clarified, they've been moved to a section where it makes more sense for them to live, a lot of times you skip over even commenting on that because it's not done. We still haven't finished, so we're going to focus on the things that we still need to improve. If you overlook those moments where you have an opportunity to reinforce what they're doing right and the correct direction it's moving in, you're going to leave a lot of room for inconsistency, because where consistency really does start to build is not at the finish line. It's more while the work is taking shape. So don't miss out on those opportunities. Our second to do in the after is movement is greater than perfection. Perfection is a fool's errand. Nothing's ever going to be perfect. But if we want to look at what we want to set the standard at, movement over it being 100% perfect matters. You're not just evaluating whether the behavior changed, you're actually helping shape how it's getting done, which is very important. And that means reinforcing what's working and redirecting what's not while it's happening. So if you have a team member who applies your feedback in a new situation and they're getting closer to what you were aiming for when you gave that feedback, but they're not quite all the way there yet, if you say something like, hey, I noticed you tried to incorporate the feedback I gave you into that situation, appreciate you. They're gonna say thank you and they're gonna be like, they noticed that I did something well. But they're still gonna be guessing about, well, which part did I do well? They didn't tell me that I did it perfectly. They just told me that I tried to apply the feedback. Okay, so what does that actually mean? And they're gonna go down their own rabbit hole. So next time they might, keep one part of it, they might drop another, they might do something else entirely. And that's where you start to get that inconsistency. If you want consistency as a leader, which you should, you can't just acknowledge the outcome. You have to call out specifically the direction it's moving in that's working so that it gets repeated. Our third to do is follow up on the work, not the person. And what I mean by that is a lot of people follow up in terms of checking with the person. Like, hey, we talked about updating that deliverable. Did you fix it? The problem there is you're just giving them an answer that has some pressure tied to it. So like their answer is probably going to be, yeah, I fixed it. But you as the leader have zero idea what they adjusted, if they were confused while they were going through it, what they actually understood, what they missed. So instead try to shift it and say, hey, that deliverable, I know I asked you to update it. Do you have some time later today to sit down and walk me through what you adjusted and what changed? And now you're able to kind of look at the work with them, ask those questions, and see what actually improved and what didn't, reinforce what's working well, redirect what's not, and that's what's going to make the behavior repeatable. Our fourth to do, if you don't have any follow-up, they are going to equate that with, this is not a priority. If there is no clear point where your feedback comes back up, surprise, it disappears. Not because it wasn't important, but because nothing that you're doing is bringing it forward again. And if you really think about that, if you give feedback on something, but like it's not part of your next check-in, it's not part of the next one-on-one, you don't review it, you don't revisit it, it's immediately going to drop behind everything else that you are checking in on. Deadlines, client work, anything else that you are making visible is going to be what takes priority over everything else. Because people are not going to prioritize based on what was said in one conversation. They're going to prioritize based on what they know is going to be looked at and checked. So if you're not coming back to it, it's not going to stick and it's going to lose out to everything else that you are addressing. And finally, our fifth to do, make it stick. To make feedback stick, it has to show up while the work is still in motion. So instead of checking in with something like, do you have any updates on deliverable X? Get specific. Ask, which sections in deliverable X were revised? Now you're paying attention to the actual work, not just progress in general. And the same applies to positive feedback, by the way. Looks good, fine to hear, people like it, it's great, but like it actually doesn't tell them what looked good or what they should keep repeating, da-da-da-da-da. We've talked about this in the positive feedback video. When feedback is vague, people do not know specifically what they should continue doing, and that's what's going to create inconsistency. We don't want inconsistency. We want consistent behavior that drives consistent results. And in order to do that, we have to make the feedback stick by being purposeful in how we're addressing it, what we're talking about, and how we're making sure that they're seeing what it is that they're doing that's going really well so they can repeat it, and what needs to be redirected so that it can be executed cleanly moving forward, and that standard is the one that's being reinforced. So I put all 5 of these to-dos up here. Go ahead, take a screenshot. Feedback is a system. This is how we approach the after the feedback is delivered. And listen, if you want this in a PDF, like drop it in the comments and I will send it to you. And we've been talking about feedback as a system. This is the part that is going to determine, does your feedback actually work? Because if your feedback isn't changing behavior, It doesn't matter how well you said it, it didn't work. You've got to name what better looks like when it's happening. You've got to reinforce movement, not just the end result. You need to stay focused on what's changing in the work and make follow-up visible so that it doesn't disappear. And this is the part that's going to determine, was my feedback effective? Was I able to make it stick? If you don't have reinforcement, the system is going to break. It's going to implode on itself. Doesn't matter how clear your message was. If you're not reinforcing it, nothing is going to change. What matters? So many things. But for today, what matters? After feedback is delivered, strong leaders first reinforce what's working. Not when it's perfect, but when it's moving in the right direction. If you don't call it out, people don't know what to repeat. Second, stay focused on what changed. Not whether it's fixed perfectly, but what's different in the work. That's what's going to make improvement visible and repeatable. And third, make that follow-up visible, right? Bring it top of mind, bring it to the surface, because if it's not coming back up, it is going to compete with everything else, and I promise you, it will lose. And this is the part that most of us miss. We deliver the feedback and we leave it alone, and then nothing changes, and we get frustrated, but it's on us because we're the ones that need to bring it back into the work. And that's what reinforcement is. Not more talking, not saying it better, not saying it again. It's making sure that the right things stay visible long enough for that feedback and the behavior change to stick. It's not just what you say, it's what you're doing in the after. So if you have been repeating the same feedback and nothing is changing, it's probably not a listening problem. So if nothing's changing, it's not a listening problem, it is a reinforcement problem. You've got to make sure that there is something in the way you are designing the after that is helping to keep the feedback strong enough to be in place. And people, again, are not going to change based on what you said once. That's just not how it works. They're going to change based on how and what keeps showing up in the after. So if nothing is changing after you're delivering feedback, this video is where you should be looking. Try those tips. Now, the other part is, even when you do get this right, even when you're perfect at it, it doesn't mean that there's not going to be resistance from certain team members on your team where defensiveness shows up, even when you're delivering the feedback right, even when you're reinforcing it in the after. Leadership is a complex thing. So the next layer that we're going to cover isn't going to be about clarity or follow-up. It's going to be about what happens when people push back and why defensiveness can keep showing up even when you handle it well, and the steps that you can take to work through that productively. Thank you for joining me.